Ilaria Allegrozzi, Senior Researcher at Human Rights Watch. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Channel Africa. Welcome.
Thank you for having me here.
Ilaria, tell us, what have you been able to find out in your investigations regarding the military in Burkina Faso?
Yeah, we published a report on abuses by army soldiers in Burkina Faso during counterinsurgency operations. And the abuses we documented in this report are only but a fraction of the human rights violations we have been able to investigate over the past few years in Burkina Faso by the army. What we documented in this report is not new, it's not a surprise. In the past, we have denounced similar abuses, and 3 weeks ago, we also published another report on abuses by armed Islamist groups in Burkina Faso. It is important to highlight this point as violations are going on by both sides and civilians are caught between two fires. All of this, as the conflict in Burkina Faso widens, spreads towards many regions of the country. Armed Islamist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State are thought to control over 40% of the country's territory. And all of this is leading to a serious humanitarian crisis with over 2 million people currently displaced, people being forced out of their homes and in great need of humanitarian assistance.
So tell us the main points of your investigations. What did you actually find out? What were these soldiers, military doing?
Yeah, so we have been able to investigate unlawful killings by the army during counterinsurgency operations conducted in several areas of the country, but also arbitrary arrests and enforced disappearances. In particular, with regards to enforced disappearances, I want to say that, as I said before, this is just a part of the thousands of people who have been forcibly disappeared by the army. There are thousands of people missing in Burkina Faso after they have been arrested by the security forces, and family members and friends are looking for them, but their whereabouts remain unknown. So we are talking about serious human rights abuses, and we also sought to include and incorporate in our reports the point of view of the authorities, but unfortunately we didn't receive any response.
Do these victims include women and children?
Indeed, women and children. In April, we also documented a large massacre of civilians in a small village in the north of the country, in Karma, where 156 civilians were killed over 4 hours of military operation by alleged soldiers. And among these victims, there were over 40 children and almost 30 women. These people have been shot in cold blood, executed, and we were able to speak with some of the survivors and family members of those victims.
Your report talks about militias being set up to support the military to defend the country. Tell us about who these militia are and how they're contributing perhaps to this problem.
Yeah, the new military authorities, which came to power last year by a military coup, have made militias, these so-called VDPs, as the main pillar of their response to insecurity and the jihadist threats in Burkina Faso. They launched a campaign to recruit over 50,000 of these civilian auxiliaries, and I think that the target has been met. And I think that while this decision of recruiting civilians to support the army is of course due also to the limited ability of the Burkinabe army to face the jihadist threats. It's also important to highlight that the recruitment of these civilians have put civilians at the center of the violence, with communities who have been targeted by the armed Islamist groups because some of their members joined the militias. And on the other hand, this has also exacerbated intercommunal tensions. Moreover, I think that the idea of arming civilians with very little training and no adequate supervision and government control is very problematic, because it seems to me the best way to increase abuses, to fuel intercommunal conflicts. And the Burkina Faso authorities really risk to exacerbate the problem by creating militias that have turned their weapons against other civilians.
It also appears as if some kind of ethnic profiling is taking place as well. Tell us about that and what might be the reason.
Yes, exactly. Most of the people that have been killed and arrested in the cases that we have been able to document were from the pastoralist ethnic Fulani community. This group has been specifically targeted because the armed Islamist groups have largely recruited among this community. And so they are now the target of military operations. And people told us that, you know, like not all Fulani are not all ethnic Fulani are jihadists, but the truth is that many of them have been targeted by the army.
What have you seen as some of the consequences for these excesses and these abuses by the military?
Well, these atrocities by the security forces are fueling recruitment by armed Islamist fighters. For over a decade, Human Rights Watch has been able to document the spread of these groups among West Africa, groups linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, which have exploited local grievances against government corruption, against banditry, against competition over natural resources like land and water, to garner recruits. But many people told us that it is vengeance actually over abuses by the army what has driven many youth into the ranks of these groups. So the killings by the army, which are war crimes, and the execution of civilians are factors contributing to fueling the ranks of armed Islamist groups.
Is anyone being held accountable? I mean, is there an authority that can even hold the army to account?
Well, unfortunately, there's a climate of impunity prevailing in Burkina Faso for present and past abuses, and there has been very little, if any, investigation and prosecution for abuses committed by government forces. And again, this is also contributing to more violence. So what we are asking the Burkinabe authorities is to make sure that those who are responsible for these serious abuses are brought to trial in fair trials.
What other recommendations do you have for Burkina Faso and maybe even the wider international community?
I think the message that we have for the Burkinabe authorities is very simple. We know that their fight against terrorism is a legitimate and necessary one, but we believe that the means that they are using are not appropriate. So we call on the Burkinabe authorities to put the protection of civilians at the center of any military operation, to root their military operations into the respect of human rights, and to hold those responsible of human rights abuses accountable. We have also recommendations for the international community to look at the crisis, the humanitarian crisis in Burkina Faso, which is not making to the headlines. It's a neglected crisis with 2 million people currently displaced. So we are calling on Burkina Faso international partners to support the humanitarian response and to make sure that those who have been displaced and those who are in need can access humanitarian aid.
Ilaria Allegrozzi, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much indeed for joining us and highlighting this, as you say, forgotten conflict to our attention. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Peter.